Well, Joey, thank you very much for your kind words. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in wishing Joey all the best tomorrow as he defends his thesis. It's such a pleasure to be among you in Ohio. You know what? It's such a pleasure, actually, to be somewhere where nobody can vote for me and nobody can vote against me. I mean, this is, you know, I see Bob McEwen nodding. He knows, he's the other legislator. He knows that, he knows the full range of wildlife that we represent in our districts. Let me put it like that. I was canvassing at the last European election in a rural part of Hampshire, and I came across a farmer who was very, very pleased to have discovered that I was his member of the European Parliament. And he told me this involved story about a pedigree bull. He'd spent a fortune on this seed bull, this stud, which apparently just wouldn't do the business. He put it with all of his heifers, it wouldn't serve any of them. And then online, he'd purchased a drug, and apparently he mixed it in with a feed. Bingo, the bull couldn't get enough. All his cows were in calf. He was absolutely delighted. And now he'd heard that the European Union was going to ban this substance on grounds that it was deleterious to human health. Well, of course, I said, let me look into that for you, sir. What's the chemical name? He said, well, I can't rightly recall the chemical name, but I can tell you that it tastes of aniseed. Like I say, wonderful to be in a place where no one can vote for or against me. You know, this is, but what a pleasure. And I really wanted to come here to say thank you to all of you who are involved in supporting the Ashbrook Centre and supporting more widely the work of this university. The really precious resource in any nation is its people and what's happening between the ears of those people. And being a nation is based on the understanding that our children are not just a random set of individuals born to a different random set of individuals. Being a nation means that we have been privileged to inherit certain freedoms from our parents, and that imposes on us an obligation to pass those freedoms on securely to our kids. And part of that is a basic understanding of what makes this country special. Basic understanding of what a privilege it is to be an American. That's the fundamental work of the Ashbrook Centre, and I cannot think of a more important task. So all of you who support it, in whatever way, whether it's financial, whether you're contributing in any other way, thank you. You don't have to be an American to understand the importance of this task. Every lover of freedom, every champion of liberty around the world is cheering you on. Thank you all for what you do. I'd like to talk tonight about what it is that tradition is founded in. What is it that raises this country? And to some extent, it's a common property, I think, to all the English-speaking peoples. You may find that an odd thing for me to say. Today is the anniversary of the beginning of the Siege of Boston. Right? Yesterday was the anniversary of the first shots being fired at Lexington and Concord, 19th of April, 1775. So why am I coming here now as a patriotic British conservative and hymning the common tradition of liberty that binds us together as English-speaking peoples? Well, part of the answer is look at what the people who were forming those militias in Massachusetts believed that they were fighting for. One of the things that's very striking is that they didn't see themselves as innovators. They didn't see themselves as revolutionaries, except in the very old sense of a revolution being a complete turn of the wheel, a setting upright of that which had been turned on its head. They saw themselves rather as conservatives. In their own minds, they were defending the freedoms that they assumed they had been born with as Englishmen against the innovations of a foreign king. I know that's not the way the story is always told now. If you go to Lexington today, the tour guide says, well, the British were over here and the Americans were over there. Literally no one used that language at the time. We'll have the story of Paul Revere thundering through the townships of eastern Massachusetts shouting, the British are coming. Think about that for about 5 seconds and you realize a fairly big flaw in the story, right? The entire population of Massachusetts had never considered itself anything except British. Now, I know that there are some eccentric people in Massachusetts. They vote in rather unusual ways, including, by the way, a town hall meeting in Lexington the other day demanding a ban on firearms in Lexington, right? Go figure. But, ladies and gentlemen, even in Massachusetts, I think it would be considered an unusual thing to shout the British are coming at a completely British population. What, of course, what he was actually saying was the redcoats were out, or in one version, the regulars are out. But what were they really defending? I think they traced the lineage of freedom back a long way, back through the English Glorious Revolution, the English Civil War, back even through the Great Charter to the folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law, that great system which makes law the property of the people, not the government. The things that we think of as universal freedoms that make modern life comfortable and rational and decent were overwhelmingly precepts developed and defended in the language in which you're listening to these words. Regular elections and uncensored newspapers, jury trials, equality between men and women, habeas corpus. There was nothing universal about them before they were defended and exported by people who speak our language. To give you an illustration of quite how rare and precious those values are, let me take you back to August 1941, the longest walk of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. In a way that would be unimaginable today, the media of that time conspired to hide the fact of FDR's polio from the electorate. Every photograph showed him seated or standing unaided. But on that day, the 10th of August 1941, invited by Winston Churchill to meet him on the decks of HMS Prince of Wales outside Placentia, FDR was determined literally to rise to the occasion. He defied all of the advice of his officials who said, you can't walk across a ship, it might buck, it might throw you in an undignified heap. Supported on one side by his son, on the other by a naval officer, leaning heavily on his cane, he made his way across the deck, while the band struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. And what followed was the most vivid demonstration of what binds the English-speaking peoples together. It happened to be a Sunday morning. So Churchill had the crews of the two vessels, the USS Augusta, which had carried Roosevelt, and HMS Prince of Wales, marshaled for a joint religious service. He chose every detail personally and meticulously, down to the hymns, down to the reading that the chaplain gave from the pulpit. It came from Joshua 1. As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. And afterwards, exultantly, Churchill burst out the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And when he said the same ideals, he wasn't making some bland generalization about being the good guys. Think of the world as it stood in August 1941. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Brest to Vladivostok, was under one form or another of authoritarian government. Freedom had been thrown back to its English-speaking heartland. You know, when we talk about universal values today, we're being polite. Just imagine that the Second World War had ended differently, or just imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There'd have been nothing universal about them then. Mankind owes its freedom to the resolve of the English-speaking peoples, and ultimately to the willingness of our fathers to defend with force of arms the dream of liberty. Well, it was as a country conscious of its identity and conscious of the deeds of our fathers that we voted to recover our independence last June. If you want to understand what motivated us, you know, you could do a lot worse. I was in Roger's office earlier, and I happened upon the Ashbrook Center's summary of the Declaration of Independence. You see how ringingly these phrases applied to our situation vis-à-vis the European Union, listing the grievances against the king, a multitude of new offices, swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Well, we know a thing or two about that vis-à-vis Brussels. Combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. I'm going to come back to that one. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. For abolishing the free system of English laws. How aptly those phrases applied to our present discontents. You know, I've never been in such a one-sided campaign, and I never expect to be again. For once, the phrase against all the odds is literally apposite. On the morning of the 23rd of June, if you translated the bookies' odds into probabilities, there was an 18% chance of a leave vote and an 82% chance of a remain vote. Every journalist afterwards cast around and they lighted on the same cliche, it was David against Goliath. You know, it was much worse than that, right? Goliath was a big fellow, we're told, right? He was 6 cubits and a span, right? He had a helmet of brass, and his coat was of brass weighing 5,000 shekels, and his spear was as a weaver's haft, and its head was of iron of 600 shekels, but he was one guy. Imagine that he'd said, I don't like the look of that little shepherd boy. Imagine that he'd sent back to Gath for reinforcements, that he'd come pursued by a phalanx of another 100 Philistines, and they'd all gone down, boom, 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 one after another, with sling stones in their foreheads. You'd have been a little bit closer to the asymmetry of forces that was there. Every major outlet, every political leadership, every corporation, every bank, the entire establishment, every Brussels-funded NGO, university, everyone, in fact, except the general population. We were up against every foreign leader from whom David Cameron could call in a favor, including Barack Obama. Barack Obama came and lectured us in the rather hectoring way that he has made his own. He said, if you vote to leave the European Union, you will be at the back of the line for any trade deal with the United States. Except he very considerately translated it into British idiom. He said, back of the queue. Those of you who have spent time in my country will know that queues are a big thing for us. It's an important cultural reference point. Back of the queue. Well, it made a difference, I have to say. There were 4 opinion polls published the following week, and they all showed a substantial swing to vote leave. I may be the only guy who's ever had the chance to say this at the Ashbrook Centre, but thank you, Barack Obama. You may have been the person who just got us across the line. You know what? I'll tell you why it didn't work. I'll tell you why it had that negative reaction. It wasn't because people have got any animus against Barack Obama. It's because we knew that he was urging on us a policy that Americans would never accept themselves. Because your polity is guided according to these principles. It's grown according to the DNA that was encoded in this Constitution. Suppose that I were to come here as a British politician and say, here's what you should do, guys. You should form a Pan-American Union that will have a Supreme Court in, Managua, that will have the power to strike down acts of Congress. And we'll have we'll have a Pan-American Parliament in Havana that will be superior to your own legislature. Why don't we throw in a central bank in Buenos Aires that will administer your new currency, the Pan-American peso? I'm guessing that most of you would respond by telling me to buzz off. 1 or 2 of you may use a stronger word than buzz. And you'd be right. No country should ever forfeit its independence. And when people thought that the leader of a friendly country was coming us and urging on us a policy that would be rejected by his own people, quite rightly, they reacted with indignation. One of my constituents summarized the campaign absolutely beautifully. She said, this is the working classes against the smirking classes. Now, the British class system is a convoluted and complicated animal. We don't really understand it ourselves. It's particularly difficult to explain it to friends from overseas, but I think most of you in this room will kind of get what she was saying, right? There was this huge imbalance of forces between, on the one hand, everyone who talks and dominates the airwaves, and on the other, the common sense wisdom of the people. If you really want to understand why we won, I can do no better than quote something that Edmund Burke wrote in 1791. He said, because 6 grasshoppers concealed beneath the fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, while thousands of great cattle take their repose beneath the shade of the British oak and chew the cud in silence. Pray do not imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. What we discovered on the 23rd of June is that the cattle were much more numerous and much wiser than the crickets. The crickets are still chirruping furiously in their rage, and never more so than in the last 2 days when the Prime Minister announced a general election to get another mandate for what she's done. And it was a very, very revealing moment. For 9 months, the people who voted Remain have said, oh, you have no permission, you have no instruction from the electorate, it was only a referendum, we're a parliamentary democracy. She then says, okay, then let's have an election. Oh, you can't do that, it's a coup, right? This was literally how the Labour Europe spokesman described calling the election. It's a coup, right? You know why? Because the people are involved again. Because once again, the grasshoppers are being trampled underfoot by the oxen. People are wiser than their leaders. And you can show that already empirically if you look at what's happened since the vote. You compare what the experts said during the campaign to what has happened since, and you see that you should always bet on the cattle rather than on the crickets. Right? We were told during the campaign that there would be a technical recession if we voted to leave, an immediate technical recession in 2016. This is what the Bank of England told us. This was not a campaign claim by the other side. What happened in the event? Britain grew faster in the 6 months following the vote than it had in the 6 months before the vote, and closed 2016 as the fastest growing major economy. Every international think tank is now uprating its forecast. The IMF did so the day before yesterday, the OECD. We were told in the campaign that unemployment would rise by 250,000 in the 2 years following the vote. It's been 9 months, and so far it's fallen by over 60,000. We were told during the campaign that if we voted to leave, the stock exchange would collapse. We weren't told that that would be the Italian stock exchange and the British stocks would be the best performing in Europe. And as I've said, we were told in the campaign that we'd be at the back of the queue for any trade deal with the US. Well, guess what? Paul Ryan is in London today saying we will have a trade deal the moment that you're ready to sign one. And by the way, I just want to say, there's one other person I want to thank on the subject of trade deals. Is there anyone here from Indiana? Anyone in the room? One person in the room from Indiana. That's probably about in line with the population of Indiana, isn't it? Right. Well, here is why I will always have a special place in my heart for Hoosiers in general and for Mike Pence in particular. Because after that Barack Obama back-of-the-queue intervention, the state of Indiana took out adverts in a number of UK papers, full-page adverts that said, cousins, whichever way you vote, you're always at the front of the business queue in Indiana. And then it listed, British Aerospace and Tate & Lyle and BP. Now, at that time, nobody thought we were going to win. There was absolutely no advantage in doing it. It was an act of pure decency. And it's at moments like that that you learn who your friends are, which is why, to the day I die, I'm always going to be a partisan for Indiana and for its then governor. But let's just look at how this trade deal might work, because I want to be honest about something. Having got to the position where we no longer have our trade with all parts of the world cut off, having got to the position where Britain can now do its own commercial accords with other countries, starting here with the world's largest economy, we have to face up to the reality that we're not winning the argument. It's the greatest paradox of the age. Free trade has elevated the human species to a pinnacle of wealth and happiness that our ancestors would have found unimaginable. As recently as 1990, 38% of human beings lived in extreme poverty, defined as an income of $1 a day or less at 1990 prices. Now that number has fallen to 8%. We can realistically look forward to the complete extirpation of extreme poverty in our lifetimes. If I think of the changes just in the time that I've been on this planet. I was born in 1971. In 1971, the average American worker had to work for more than a month to earn enough to buy a TV set. And now it's less than 2 days. In 1971, a stationary car emitted more pollution than a car moving at full speed today. In 1971, fewer than half of girls worldwide completed at least primary education. Now it's more than 90%. And what has wrought this miracle? The entry of previously closed economies, particularly in Asia and Africa, into the global market system. And yet, at a time when we have never been so well off, and when it's never been clearer that the reason we're so well off is specialization and trade, in every part of the world, in developing and in wealthy countries, idealistic people, altruistic, well-meaning people are protesting trade deals, picketing G20 summits, occupying stock exchanges, thinking that by opposing free trade, they're standing up for the poorest people on the planet against the big corporates. In reality, they are doing exactly the opposite. Nobody gains more from distortions and tariffs and quotas than the big multinationals who lobby for them. Nobody gains more from their lifting than the poorest people on the planet. To give you an idea of what trade has done for us, or what life would be like without it. Last year, an American decided to make himself a chicken sandwich. Nothing particularly unusual there, you might think, but this particular American decided to do the whole thing from scratch. He milked a cow, he curdled the milk to turn it into cheese, he pickled a cucumber, he ground the grain and baked the bread. He traveled to the sea and boiled off the seawater to get the salt, and the whole process took him 6 months and cost him several $1,000s. And by the way, I think even the way he did it was kind of a cheat, because he flew to the sea, right? If you really wanted the complete self-reliance option, he'd have needed to build the aircraft himself, as well as raise the cow himself and grow the wheat himself. It's the most human thing to be blasé about what's familiar, to take things for granted. But the next time that you buy a chicken sandwich, think about everything that has gone into it. Not just the chicken and the lettuce and the mayonnaise and so on, but everything, all the things that you don't see. There was a lumberjack who chopped down the tree that made the carton. There was somebody who did the accounts for that company. There was a guy who drove it to your town so that you could buy it conveniently. There was somebody who stacked the shelves. And now ponder the almost miraculous fact that that chicken sandwich is available to somebody on the minimum wage for the equivalent of 19 minutes' work. And in that shrinkage, from 6 months to 19 minutes, can be found the whole of human civilization. Symphonies and Snapchat and starships and Starbucks. All of it comes in that shrinkage of time. People will often say, you conservatives, you don't value the real things in life. You're so obsessed with GDP growth, you're missing the big things. What about friends and family? What about listening to Beethoven? What about going for a nice walk in the country? What about spending more time with your kids? My friends, think of the chicken sandwich. The reason we have time to do all these things is because of the wonder of the market system. It's because you can now afford a dishwasher that you have time to go for that nice walk in the country instead of doing all the dishes. It's because you can now drive to work instead of taking a series of trams and buses that you can now go and listen to the Beethoven. It's because you don't have to work 7 days a week just to feed your kids that you have time to play with them at weekends. I don't know a single conservative, maybe there's one in this room, but I've yet to meet one who thinks that you get more pleasure from a big bank balance than from doing those things. The miracle is that we have come up with an economic system that liberates people, that allows people to enrich themselves by doing the right thing. In every other system, the way you prosper is you suck up to the people in authority, whether they're commissars or kings or theocrats. Capitalism uniquely means that you get on by offering a service to the people around you. I fractionally enriched Bill Gates when I bought his software. Okay? I added a tiny amount to his net wealth. But look at how he enriched me. That's the real miracle of our system, and it was a system, again, evolved in the language in which you're listening to these words. That's the heritage of which you're custodians. And it's not just that free trade has made us wealthier. It's made us happier and freer. Think of how our species has existed for most of the last 10,000 years. You look at somewhere like North Korea now, you think there's a slave state with people in semi-starvation and a handful of leaders with harems and monuments and so on. That was the normal human condition for 10,000 years for almost all of our ancestors. Somebody discovered that you could put seeds in the ground and that crops would grow, right? I'm afraid it only took about 5 minutes for the next discovery, which is it is easier and less demanding to steal somebody else's crop than to spend all year tending to your own. And then it wasn't long before the real breakthrough, which is that if you really wanted to optimize the ratio of effort to outcome, you would regularize that plunder. You'd get people to go and do it for you through tithes and tolls and taxes. And thus was civilization born in tyranny and oppression. And thus it continued for most of the last 10,000 years. The lot of the human race was poverty, serfdom, slavery, caste, until the extraordinary breakthrough that happened in our language. That people learned how to elevate the rules above the rulers, the individual above the collective. But that we became free to deal with one another autonomously, on a case-by-case basis, instead of having all of our relations mediated by caste, tradition, and birth. That's the real miracle of the Western system. And it's a miracle that found its supreme expression in the old courthouse in Philadelphia that produced these documents. That's the real case for open markets. It's not just that it means that we get cheaper smartphones. Free trade is the ultimate instrument of poverty alleviation, of conflict resolution, of social justice, and of political liberty. This needs saying. I was watching the last presidential election here, and I could not find many people prepared to make that case. The candidates were attacking each other for buying stuff abroad. Nobody was prepared to say, well, actually, you know what? It's a good thing to buy things abroad if they're cheaper. It means that you can concentrate on doing the stuff that you do best. That's why we don't live like that chicken sandwich guy. That's the basis of all the wealth that we now take for granted. Now, the argument against is always made in some superficially plausible way. Yeah, I'm in favor of free trade, but it's got to be balanced, or there's a strategic sector here, or this country is trying to dump or produce goods at below cost price. To show you why all of those arguments are specious, let me just ask you all one question. Why is it that when we're at war, we blockade the enemy? Now, what are we trying to achieve when we cut off a hostile belligerent? We're disrupting their supply lines, we're trying to make them poorer. Can we all agree that we're not doing it to nurture their infant industries? We're not trying to help them by making them more self-sufficient in energy or in food. We're not trying to build them up so that they can be more competitive in world markets. Every tariff, every restriction amounts to a self-blockade. You are doing to yourselves in peacetime, voluntarily, what enemies seek to do to hurt you in war. Yeah, there's always a special case. And the reason it happens, let me tell you this, frankly, as somebody who's been an elected politician for long enough to know how the system works, the reason it happens is because the people who gain from the restrictions and the tariffs are politically motivated, concentrated, and aware of how to do it. In the last presidency, the Obama presidency, there was an issue about Chinese steel, just like now. It was a big protest by the United Steelworkers. And it resulted in tariffs being applied to Chinese manufactured wheels, steel wheels, truck and car wheels. It went up to 35% in stages. And sure, 1,200 jobs were supposedly saved by this, at a cost of $1.1 billion. 1,200 jobs that paid an average of $40,000 each. Okay. For an outlay of $1.1 billion, jobs were saved that were worth $48 million. But it's much worse than that. Because people had to spend more on the wheels, they had less money to spend on everything else. Money was taken out of the economy, and jobs were lost. How many jobs? 3,700. Some of them held, no doubt, by members of the United Steelworkers. So we destroyed 3,700 jobs to save 1,200 at a cost of $1.1 billion to save 48 million. Why does it happen? I'll tell you in 4 words. Free trade brings dispersed gains, concentrated losses. I'll give you another example since we're at the other end of the country. The price of sugar in the US is about twice what it is in the rest of the world. Why? Because there are some sugar cane planters in Florida, and Florida is a swing state. Simple as that. How many jobs are lost in confectionery and candy making? Well, you know what? For every job on a sugar plantation in Florida, 16 jobs are lost in food processing. So why do the politicians do it? Why do both parties retain these quotas and these tariffs? I'll tell you why. Because those 16 people whose jobs would exist without them don't know who they are. Right? These are 16 putative jobs. These are 16 jobs that exist only in the subjunctive. Whereas the guy who's going to lose his job in Florida, he knows exactly whom to blame and he votes accordingly. So how ultimately do we win this argument? Given that political awkwardness, and given also, let's be frank about this, the real problem, which is that free trade is counterintuitive. It is literally counterintuitive. It's running up against millions of years of evolution, right? We're all inclined by our hunter-gatherer past to want to hoard food, to want to be self-sufficient, to provide against famine. How do you win the argument? You do it! Once you've done it, nobody ever goes back. Look at the countries that have really opened their markets, the Singapores, the Hong Kongs, the New Zealands. Yeah, there was a lot of trauma when they did it. No one in any of those countries is now seriously suggesting that they go back to tariffs, quotas, or other restrictions because they can see that free trade has made them all rich and that the best benefits have been felt by the poorest people. Singapore became independent in 1960. It had less than half of Britain's GDP per head in 1960. Now it's nearly twice. They've gone from being half as rich as us to being twice as rich as us. In a place where there are no natural resources, they have to import their drinking water. It's been turned from a tropical, mosquito-infested swamp into a gleaming city-state. How? Simply by buying what everybody else had to sell. This is the opportunity we now have, your country and mine. We can do a deal which will work to enrich everybody. A tie-up between the largest and the 5th largest economies in the world. A consummation devoutly to be wished. Countries linked by language and law, by habit and history, by commerce and kinship. The US is the single biggest investor in Britain. The United Kingdom is the single biggest investor here. Every day, 1 million Americans clock in to work for British companies. Every day, 1 million Brits turn up to work for American-owned companies. The only thing that hasn't followed up until now has been the trade, because the trade has been controlled by Brussels, not London. But that can now change. We have the opportunity to have a genuinely open free trade accord based on the consumer, not the producer. Avoiding some of the cartels, some of the corporatism that was creeping into Obama's Atlantic and Pacific deals. Having a system that is based on straightforward mutual product recognition. If something is legal here, it should be legal in Britain and vice versa. Simple as that. If you can practice in Wall Street, you can practice in the City of London. If you can sell insurance in Britain, you can sell it here. If a drug is approved by the FDA, that's good enough for us. That's it. That's all you need to do. You can lift both economies by billions of dollars at no cost. And in doing so, you will restore the Great Alliance, which was so vivid in Churchill's time. Alliance of free English-speaking peoples on which the freedom and happiness of mankind depends more than anybody likes to admit. I began by reminding you that today is the anniversary of the beginning of the Siege of Boston. Well, let me take you forward just 10 years after that. John Adams, the future president, arrived at the court of St. James as the first ambassador of an independent American republic. Right? It could have been an awkward meeting with George III. But he made a speech that was so handsome and affecting that the crazy old monarch was moved to tears. And he finished by saying, "Your Majesty, I should esteem myself the happiest of men if I could restore the old good nature and old good humor between peoples who, though separated by an ocean and living under different governments, have yet the same language, similar religion, and kindred blood. My friends, I am so optimistic about our alliance, about our country, and about yours. I look at what's happening here, I see the huge opportunities opening up, the deregulation that can now happen, the cutting of taxes, particularly of corporate taxes, to a level that the rest of the world would recognize as normal, the return of powers from Washington to the states, from unelected bureaucrats to elected representatives, the appointment of judges who will rule on the basis of what the law actually says, rather than on the basis of what they think the law ought to say. All of these things lie in your near future, and we will be standing alongside you as you reclaim that inheritance. It's impossible not to feel optimistic on a day like this. Ohio blooming, the blossom on the tree, the season pulsing around us, the birdsong reaching its crescendo. I feel deep in my bones that the best is yet to come. We may no longer have exactly kindred blood. Both of our countries have been enlarged by migratory flows, by demographic change. But we have something much more important. We have kindred minds. We have the same ideals. We sing the same songs. We kneel at the same altars. And we cleave alike to the dream of freedom. Keep fast to that dream, my friends. Preserve it intact. Pass it on securely to your children. Thank you.
So Daniel, just to begin with a somewhat distinctly American question, how can a country surrender its government to a body who they do not control?
Right. It's a pretty good question, isn't it? And you only have to put the question to see the answer. You know, I was talking to somebody yesterday in Georgia about the powers of the UN. He was very against it, and I sympathized. But there was a little bit of me thinking, what a luxury to be able to worry about the United Nations, right? That you don't have the European Union as the more immediate threat to your sovereignty. I would love to be able to worry about the UN as the biggest threat to our democracy, a position that we're happily going to be in a couple of years from now. How can anyone be better off giving up the right to hire and fire the people who pass their laws? Our country's greatest export, our supreme contribution to the happiness of mankind, was the sublime idea that laws should not be passed nor taxes raised except by our own elected representatives. Who are we governed by in Brussels? Executive and legislative power is combined in the hands of appointed officials who are immune to public opinion, invulnerable to the ballot box. Now, you don't have to be anti-Europe to see that that is a rotten system. Well, let me put this another way. I got a friendly email the day before the vote from a friend in Boston who said, listen, don't worry. We voted leave in 1776, and it's working out okay for us.
So several people had questions about the future of the European Union. For example, the upcoming French election, how likely is it that Brexit is going to lead to a movement for similar type votes in other countries?
It's a very good question. Who's going to be next to leave? Will the whole system unravel? There are one or two countries that may choose to leave in a way that we did, through democratic process, through a referendum or an election. Up or near the top of the list there, I'd have to say, are the Netherlands and Denmark, two countries that were traditionally very skeptical about political union. Although coming up on the rails is Ireland, which has been very, very badly hit by the euro crisis, and which after Brexit is going to be in a very anomalous position if it's dealing with a permanent competitive advantage in by far its largest trading partner. But you have to say that the likelihood is not that another country will leave through choice in an orderly way. The likelihood is that before that there will be a disorderly collapse, triggered perhaps by a banking crisis in Italy or triggered by the election of Marine Le Pen in France. In that situation, very quickly the system will unravel. I was talking to your president, who is from Cuba, about how quickly things unravel. I can remember traveling in Eastern Europe, as we still called it, in the 1980s, and thinking, on the one hand, this just can't survive. Nobody believes in this rotten system. But on the other, there's no way of seeing how it's going to end. Will it end because of some huge Chernobyl-type breakdown or some, war? Or, In the end, it just collapsed like that. One day, the Hungarian interior minister stopped requiring exit visas from East Germans who wanted to visit Austria. Within 2 weeks, the whole system was gone. Permanence is the illusion of every age. The challenge is to ensure that if and when the European Union does disassemble, that we have something better to put in its place. And that something for me should be a free trade area based on democratic, intergovernmental cooperation among friendly, cooperating, independent states.
So Prime Minister May's decision to call this election, for those of us who are casual observers, I think it came as a surprise that it would happen that quickly. What's your sense of this? Is this a good thing, or how is this likely to unfold?
As you'll have gathered, I have a great belief in the wisdom of the electorate. I really do, and I think this is a fundamental Burkean conservative characteristic. Bill Buckley used to say he would rather be governed by the first 1,000 names chosen at random from the Boston Telephone Book than by the economics faculty of Harvard University. And actually, given how many of the central bankers during the collapse 8 years ago were graduates of the economics faculty of Harvard University, he was literally correct about that. But for that reason, I'm pretty confident that the British electorate will vote for candidates who want to make a success of our withdrawal and who want to make us a global country, interested and involved with the affairs of every continent, including Europe, but living under our own affairs. So I don't want to tempt fate, but I would be pretty horrified if Theresa May does not emerge from this process with an enhanced majority. I'm going to say one other thing. The students here heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. Almost every commentator is now comparing Theresa May to Margaret Thatcher. And that's kind of inevitable, right? There's only been 2 female prime ministers in the UK, and they're both tough-minded Tories. By the way, I'm very proud of the fact that both women were elected on their own merits, rather than trying to get their Banana Republic style as the wife of some previous guy. That didn't strike me as a particular advance in the cause of women. But that's your issue, not mine. Actually, though, Theresa May's position is much stronger than Margaret Thatcher's ever was. She took over when our economy was at its weakest point. She was never popular in her party. She was ultimately ousted by a coup within her own party. She was never popular in the opinion polls on a personal level. And the magnitude of her achievement is this, that she won 3 elections and the Cold War and transformed our economy from a position of weakness. Now, Theresa May is beginning with every advantage that Margaret Thatcher lacked. Our economy is growing, as I mentioned earlier. Her party is completely united behind her, to the extent that the other candidates all dropped out rather than facing an election against her. Her opinion poll ratings are stratospheric, and she faces no opposition. Our Labour Party has gone off into a kind of bizarre left-wing introversion where it's no longer interested in winning. Someone said, is it a bit like if Bernie Sanders... No, Bernie Sanders is a moderate compared to Jeremy Corbyn. We have a Labour leader who supports Hamas and Hezbollah and the IRA, who thinks that, mining coal is a really good thing that we should subsidize, but burning coal should be bad. This is a different level of eccentricity. The only thing she has lacked up until now is a personal mandate. Well, 50 days from now, she will have that personal mandate, and she will be in terms of her legitimacy and authority, the most powerful leader in Europe.
What effect will Brexit have on the attempts of the Scots and the Welsh to leave Great Britain?
Well, Wales and England voted to leave the EU. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain, and that creates an indirect constitutional challenge. I mean, literally, there's no problem because it was the UK that voted as a single unit. But in practical terms, the UK has to work as a partnership. And that means that the 52% who voted leave have to take seriously the concerns of the 48% who voted to stay, and particularly in Scotland, where it was a 3-2 vote to remain. So far, though, there has been no sign at all that discrepancy of votes has led to any resurgence of separatist feeling in Scotland. In fact, quite the contrary. If the polls are to be believed, Scots are more pro-United Kingdom now than they were before the Brexit vote. And I think this is partly because there was a general swing after the last referendum, the price of oil has collapsed and so on. It's partly because there is a new argument now that preferring the European market, which is about 7% of their total trade, to the English market, which would be 79% of their trade, is kind of an eccentric thing. And Scots, three of my four grandparents were Scottish. Scots know a thing or two about how to make money and how to prosper and which way to make the canny and rational decisions. So that's not the challenge. The bigger challenge, funnily enough, I think, is in Ireland. There is a circumstance where this could go wrong. I think it's a very unlikely one, but we should be aware of it. The circumstance in which things go wrong is if we end up with some kind of hard border in Ireland again. The political question in Ireland has pretty much disappeared since 1998. Last opinion poll, when people were asked, do you want an immediate move to a united Ireland, 11% of Northern Irish Catholics, 11% of Northern Irish Catholics, 6% of the total population, or 5%, 5.something%, wanted an immediate move to united Ireland. How many wanted it at all? In any timescale, 31% of the whole population, right? Why has that issue disappeared? Because the border has disappeared. It's not worth quarreling over something that isn't there. You only really have to remember which country you're in when you're paying your taxes. The rest of the time, it's just ceased to be an issue. So London and Dublin have a shared interest in ensuring that status continues, that we find a way of recognizing that the Republic of Ireland is not a completely foreign country, that we have reciprocal rights. I think that is likely to happen. The European Union says it wants that to be the outcome. You won't find anyone, as I say, in either the British or Irish parliaments who wants a change. We had a common travel zone for years before either of us joined the European Union, and that travel area includes some non-EU territories, so it can happen. But that's really the only worry. If I'm 100% honest with you, the only thing that I think could go wrong would be a return to tribal identity in Northern Ireland, which I think we can all agree would be a step backwards.
Very interesting. Do you think that there are any similarities between the Brexit vote and Trump's election?
There are similarities, but I wouldn't completely overdo them, right? There are big differences too. A big chunk of Donald Trump's campaign, as I understand it, was that he didn't want free trade with China. A big chunk of our campaign was that we did want free trade with China. We do want free trade with China. The European Union won't let us have it, and outside the European Union, we expect to sign a bilateral treaty with the Chinese, as the Swiss and the Icelanders and the other non-EU countries have done. So there are differences. But there is also the similarity, the obvious one, the working classes versus the smoking classes, right? It's the idea of a failed political elite governing in its own interests rather than that of the population at large, and then the people breaking back in and saying, hang on, that's not how the system works. Ultimately, we're in charge. First line of your constitution. You know, the defense mechanism ultimately is the electorate itself. And in both countries, that defense mechanism worked.
Dan, I'll make this the last question. How will Brexit revive the British-American strategic relationship or cooperation?
I have not felt so optimistic about British-American relations since George W. Bush was in the White House. We went through a period of some estrangement. during the last presidency, and that has come to an end. I was fortunate enough last month to spend a couple of days on the Hill, courtesy of the great Bob McEwen, who's sitting there. And I think it's fair to say, Bob, that we didn't meet a single person who was not enthusiastic about a bilateral US-UK trade deal and about an intensification of our strategic alliance. And we shouldn't be shy about this. Just for a second, imagine the world without that alliance. It suddenly becomes a pretty dark and gloomy place. So, there will be a variety of opinions in this room about the merits and demerits of this president. Of course there are. I mean, it's a democracy. It's right that there should be a variety of opinions. But I have to say, from a narrowly British point of view, he couldn't be friendlier. In fact, he even seems to want to use us as a sort of example of why he's not a protectionist. Yeah, it's only the Chinese I've got a problem with. The Brits, now there we've got no problem having a proper free trade agreement. Well, great. I've learned something about politics and about politicians. If you want to get the best out of your politicians, it's a bit like with small children. You should praise good behavior rather than scolding bad behavior. Try and reinforce the positive. Right? Don't think that just because someone is a senator that he's outgrown that. Right? It's a very human characteristic. So you can, as a free trader, you can say, oh, Donald Trump's proposal to have a 20% tariff on Mexican goods would be a disaster. It will cost the Treasury money. It will shrink the US economy. And the idea of a trade war with the second biggest economy in the world would be calamity. You could say all of that. Or you can say, yeah, Mr. President, go back to what you were just saying about Britain. I'll tell you, it's a much more effective tactic. And if we can make a trade deal deliver, if we can show that the biggest beneficiaries are the people on lowest incomes who make the biggest gains from the price falls that will follow, then maybe we can extend that to other countries. The best way to win this argument is to do it and show that it works.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dan Hannan. Well, thank you all for coming this evening. I'd like to remind you about Joey's thesis defense tomorrow at noon in the Ashbrook Center. If you can't make that, we're going to have Tucker Carlson back here on this stage on June 3rd, and hope you all will be here for that. I'd like to thank my friend and fellow Ashbrook board member Bob McEwen and his wife Liz for introducing Danielle and I to Dan, who has become a good friend, and glad he's now a friend of the Ashbrook Center. So thank you for making the trip. We'll have the book signing out in the lobby in just a moment, so thank you all, and drive safely.